Why is it that so many companies insist on placing years of experience or a list of college degrees or some other form of credentialism over genuine demonstrated skill in the hiring and promotion processes? I think the two oftentimes go hand in hand, years of experience versus competence, but I think it might be constructive to understand how often they don't. When an employee is hired based on any other metric than demonstrated competence, then I think all kinds of mischief are bound to follow. Just to illustrate my point here, let's say a new hire, we'll call him Bob, is brought in as a senior Erdschmerg. According to Bob's resume, he's been Erdschmerging for almost 741 years, and he holds 14 doctorates in advanced Erdschmergery. At first, everyone is pleased. Bob's excited to begin his new job, and the employers are congratulating themselves on finding such a qualified candidate. But it doesn't take long for reality to set in. Bob's first project reveals that, despite his resume stating otherwise, he's actually not a very skilled Erdschmerg, and some of his initial projects are substandard. Lower management is at a loss as how to handle this situation, so as a Band-Aid type of fix, they make the perplexing decision to bring in lower-level Erdschmergs to fix Bob's work. These lower-level Erdschmergs find it a bitter pill to swallow that they're fixing the work of an employee who makes twice what they do. And Bob is frustrated and confused as well because management no longer seems to trust him to perform the role he was hired for, and instead have him sweeping and cleaning up after the lower-level Erdschmergs. His resentment and disillusionment grow and grow over time until the point that Bob gives up and quits. Now the hiring committee must find another candidate to replace Bob. The company has to eat the cost of Bob's elaborate integration into the company, plus that of his replacement. The hiring committee has to go through this process of finding another senior Erdschmerg to replace Bob, and it's anyone's guess as to whether they will have learned any lessons or if the cycle is just going to repeat itself over and over again. I will say this though, a hiring committee staffed by people who've been competent in their own lives will be largely unmoved by credentialism. That's because they understand from their own experience that for every truly qualified job applicant, there are probably 10 or 12 impeccably credentialed candidates who, unfortunately, also happen to be unimpressive dolts. But how is it possible that someone with so many years of experience or so many degrees in a given field could still just frankly suck at that thing? And I think an anecdote from my own past might help shed a little light on this subject. When I arrived at my first duty station when I was about 19 years old, this is like 30 years ago now, I was in the Army band, and one of the first people that I met was a horn player. One of the first things that I met about him, in addition to the fact that he practiced hours a day, and he had probably had practice for hours a day for 20 years by that point, was the fact that he was terrible. And no disrespect to this guy. He's a nice guy, nothing against him. But I just found this really to be mysterious. To me, the fact that he'd been doing something so long, but also was terrible at it, those were two irreconcilable things. Well, I think something that helped explain it was when I had occasion to witness his practice routine. I remember distinctly him bringing all his practice materials into the day room and setting up in front of the TV. And then he turned the TV on, and it was Simpsons primetime. And so he would watch The Simpsons for the entirety of his practice routine for a couple hours or whatever. And, to become skilled, to become truly competent at something requires dedication. It requires repetition. It requires introspection. I mean, you've got to have the ability to self-examine. And sacrifice, And if your ears are chock full of instead of the sound of your instrument, so that you can listen to it and make the necessary changes to your tone or to your scales or whatever song you're playing, then I think that really helps explain how he never really progressed past the point of mediocrity and instead just kind of remained in a perpetual state of ineptitude. I had a guy make a comment on one of my videos that was completely backwards regarding welding technique. He was as wrong as he was certain about what he said. And I don't want to be too specific here because my point here isn't to humiliate someone. When I asked him to explain his assertion, He instead listed his qualifications and said that he'd been welding for 40 plus years. So he didn't actually answer my question. I thanked him for his comment and moved on. I've never really been a fan of comment sections for a forum of debate. But my thoughts on his comments are this, though. Number one, your years of experience don't make your comment any more true than any other falsehood. And two, a person with this amount of experience should easily be able to explain himself without the need to appeal to authority. In this case, his appeal to authority was his appeal to his supposed credentials. And maybe he has been welding for that long, but I think this guy fits into the category, at least based on his comment and the very short interaction that I had with him. I think this guy may fall into the category of sort of what we're talking about here. When I was a new student at the Armed Forces School of Music, I remember thrashing away on the drums like Animal from the Muppets. No one had ever really taught me how to practice, and so my idea of practicing was just to get on those drums and flail around for a couple hours and work on the stuff, that I felt comfortable with, work, quote unquote, work on it. But one day, not long after I'd gotten to the school, I remember my future instructor opening the door to my practice room and introducing himself in a friendly way, and I thought, oh, cool. I'm going to love this guy. And then he says to me, you know what you're doing? Just then, you were musically masturbating. And I was like, oh no, this guy sucks. But the reality is, this guy actually rescued me from falling into a certain life trap. Most people would never have the courage and candor to say something like that to somebody because most people are afraid of that kind of potential confrontation. And probably even fewer people would respond well to that kind of criticism. He might just as well have said nothing. And as the years rolled by, I might have just begun to assume that since I'd been playing for a certain amount of time, then that's, then I must be good. If the theme here is that time spent doing something or the amount of degrees you have in that subject are not the prime factors, or shouldn't be anyway, in determining a person's level of competence, then what in the world is my point? In answer to that question, consider my time at welding school, where in a class of 20 plus people, you had 2 or 3 standouts. Were these just people that had been supremely gifted by God? No, these were the guys who stayed late. They spent all their time in their booths instead of socializing. They worked on the stuff they weren't good at, even though that requires, a certain amount of courage. They sought out other methods of instruction like YouTube videos in their free time after hours. Contrast those guys with the majority of the population who showed up late every day, spent all their time around the break table, worked on only the aspects of welding that they were comfortable with. The welding student with the good habits and attitude carried those qualities into the workforce, and the result was a skilled tradesman in a relatively short amount of time. The other guys were the ones who decades later are still flirting with mediocrity, but spend their time bragging about how long they've been welding because that's really all they have to offer. In this example, I think makes it clear that strictly years of experience is not a coherent method of discerning the one individual from the other. Jesus talks about this very concept in Matthew chapter 13. In that parable, most of the seeds that the farmer casts don't germinate because they're eaten by birds, or they fell on rocky ground instead of soil, or the thorny weeds choke them. But other seeds found fertile ground and produced wonderful results. In this parable, Jesus is referring to the condition of a person's heart as it pertains to the gospel message. But I could use this same illustration to describe how people respond to learning of any kind. Those welding students who didn't learn much at school were the seeds that didn't germinate because, for whatever reasons, their minds weren't fertile soil. Maybe they were distracted by phones, or maybe they didn't really understand the importance of school because they didn't pay for it, or, what have you. Their competence, their abilities, their mastery. Past a certain point, all these have much more to do with their approach to learning, which I might describe as the fertility of the mind, than to the years they were at it. Well, I've been doing this for 50 years. Well, yeah, but you suck at it. If I were you, I wouldn't admit how long I've been doing it. If I was this bad at it. What have you been doing this whole time? I'll tell you one thing you haven't been doing: welding. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got relative newcomers or otherwise uncredentialed people to a given field that are just killing it. As an interesting side note that I'll point out in a second when I tell this story, those highly competent newcomers or outsiders are often reviled by the establishment because the establishment, which relies on their credentials to speak for them, are very threatened by an outsider who demonstrates real ability and understanding. Speaking of outsiders, take the case of John Harrison, a lowly carpenter who had a love for making clocks in his spare time. Until the mid-1700s, it wasn't possible to determine longitude at sea because figuring out longitude required an accurate method of keeping time while at sea, but the movement of the ship interfered with the pendulums of clocks. So sailors the world over would routinely get lost, and oftentimes the ships were sunk with all hands and treasure lost because they were mistaken about their location and they smashed into rocks that weren't supposed to be there or some other calamity having to do with being lost. Well, England realized this wasn't sustainable and they got tired of losing ships full of men and treasure. So the Royal Society of England offered the modern equivalent of $5 million to the first person to come up with a solution to the problem. So John Harrison, a common cabinet maker with no credentials to speak of, got to work designing a clock. He persisted year after year, decade after decade, until he finally produced a clock that could withstand the movement of a ship at sea. What makes this story all the more fascinating is that despite the fact that it took him multiple decades to create his successful design, which must have been agonizing beyond belief, that wasn't even his greatest challenge. The greatest difficulty was being taken seriously by the establishment of the time. Here was a guy who presented a demonstrable solution to an impossibly expensive problem of the ages. And yet, because he wasn't a member of the intelligentsia, the credential class, for a long time, Mr. Harris's solution to the problem, and unfortunately the man himself, were sometimes met with indifference and ridicule. But how could that be? I mean, did England want to stop losing their sailors and treasure or not? Well, consider the case of Jesus as he related to the Pharisees. Their relationship was antagonistic the whole time. The Pharisees wanted to kill him. They hated him. And why is that? Well, it's a mystery until you realize that the Pharisees were the credential class. They were the learned among men, and they had all kinds of status in the eyes of other people. And here was this newcomer, this guy who didn't have any credentials, and he was challenging them with his wisdom and his understanding of, the things he was talking about and the things the Pharisees thought they understood. They had entire portions of Scripture memorized, but at the same time somehow didn't have any understanding of it. And they were threatened by that. And it turns out that in some cases, and this was one of them, it's easier to murder somebody than to have the courage to address your own inadequacies. I think years of experience should definitely be considered in the hiring process, but it would be foolish to single experience out as the sole consideration, and I would go a step further and argue it shouldn't even be the primary one. I think I should, at this point, clarify that I've got nothing at all against credentials. I think that in the right context, they can be useful and informative for a potential employer in the hiring process, and they can be a badge of honor to the person who possesses them. My issue is with credentialism. I think the natural result of credentialism in society is that not only do many people think that people with a certain pedigree are automatically more competent than others, but those credentialed people begin to think that about themselves. They begin to believe that based solely on their credentials, they're smarter and more competent than they actually are. Demonstrated competence is far more valuable than supposed credentials. And why is that such a true statement? Because so often there's a huge disparity between the stratospheric value a person places on himself versus the reality of things. Any job applicant can claim experience and skill, but the ability to tangibly demonstrate those skills is so much more rare and therefore meaningful. I think it's great to have as much experience as you can get your hands on, and I'm a huge fan of learning. But I think that if those things aren't coupled with some serious introspection, the ability to really self-examine and find out where you are in terms of your knowledge and your abilities, then the results can be disastrous. Rather than hang our hats on credentials, I think we all should become masters of self-examination. And hiring committees, for the love of God, please stop throwing away candidates who don't have 17 degrees and 350 years of experience. For all you know, you actually might be throwing away the next John Harrison.